All right, today's date is December 4th, 2023. My name is Dennis Gill with the Americans in Wartime Experience. I am in Virginia conducting a virtual interview with Edie Meeks. Thank you, Edie, for sitting down and agreeing to talk to us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Where are you right now?
I'm in Beacon, New York.
Beacon, New York. Okay. All right. So tell us just a little bit about you. Where did you grow up? Where were you born? Go to school? That kind of thing.
I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and went to nursing school in Rochester, Minnesota. And then from there, I traveled to north central British Columbia, where I worked for a year and a half, and then went down to Los Angeles to see my brother, who was selling encyclopedias door to door. And since he wasn't making much money, I thought, gee, maybe I should get a job down here. So I did. And while we were there, he was drafted. And so he joined the Marine Corps and went to Camp Pendleton. And I was there for his graduation from boot camp. And I kept thinking to myself, if something happened to him over there in Vietnam, I would want somebody who was there who wanted to be there. And so I went back to Minneapolis and signed up in the Army Nurse Corps. And as I tell people, I called my brother and I said, I've signed up in the Army Nurse Corps. He said, that is absolutely wonderful. And I said, well, why do you say so? And he said, because the Navy takes care of the Marines. So he figured his sister wouldn't be bossing him around.
And what year would that have been?
That was 1968 when I joined the Army Nurse Corps.
Okay.
In February. Mm-hmm.
And you were already a nurse?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So what kind of extra training do you go to when you join the Army? And how is the Army Nurse Corps different?
The Army Nurse Corps, the only thing I can say is, again, when I went through basic training for the Army Nurse Corps, I wrote to my brother Tom and I said, I don't know why you complained about basic training. The maid comes in every day and makes the bed and we're perfectly fine. He couldn't believe it. But the Army Nurse Corps at that time, we weren't really soldiers. We weren't allowed to carry weapons. We were allowed to, in basic training, qualify on the M16 if we wanted to, which I decided to do. Coming from Minnesota, everybody up there hunts.
Right.
And so Dad had guns and my brothers had guns. And so I figured if somebody comes through the door and all my patients are flat on their back, somebody ought to know how to, take care of them. So I did qualify. I made marksman on the M16. And they also taught you things like how to do tracheotomies on live animals. They taught us and how to do cut downs. And because if things got really bad, everything kind of escalated up one level so that you would be doing things that you normally wouldn't do, but you had to know how to do them too.
Okay.
They also taught us, it was kind of bizarre in a way. They were teaching us how to care for people who were injured in war. And then they had a colonel come in and tell us about the firepower of all these different weapons. And he just loved it. And I thought, this is like schizophrenic almost, hearing about these horrible weapons and about Agent Orange, which defoliates everything, and how wonderful he thought it was. And so it was really kind of a bizarre time. The gals who were there were wonderful. You make lifelong friends. From there, I went to Fort Ord, California, and worked there for 3 months on an orthopedic ward where all of my patients had come from Vietnam and had some kind of a bone injury. And from there, I went to Vietnam and was assigned to the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon in the intensive care unit. And I thought that I was prepared because I had done emergency room nursing before. And in British Columbia, we had taken care of a lot of it was a 46-bed hospital, and when people came in, you just took care of them.
Right.
You know, whether whether it was a hatchet accident or shotgun or whatever it was. But nobody prepared you for this. It was perfectly healthy young men coming in, blown to pieces, and it didn't make sense. I think that was the hardest part, and it took me years to figure out what it was that it didn't make sense. In the
Right.
emergency room, everything makes sense. You know, if a fat guy comes in, he's had a heart attack, well, that makes sense. Uh, Kid falls out of a tree, breaks his leg, that makes sense. Somebody comes in with a head injury, they weren't wearing a helmet when they were riding a motorcycle, that makes sense. But over there, nothing made sense. All of these injuries were so horrific, at least the ones that we got in the intensive care unit, that you're saying this could be my brother. The age limit of most of the guys that we got in was 18 to 23. And so I had two younger brothers, Tom, who was the Marine, and Charlie, who was 2 years younger than Tom. And for me, it was like these were my brothers, and you could see the worth and the potential in each one that came in. And you knew that they had families back home. And you wish that you could talk to the families, but you couldn't. That was one of the hard things too, was if you worked so hard on this young man and then he died, and you couldn't talk to the parents and say he was so brave, he tried,
Right.
you know, and somebody was there with him. So I would say I went over there in July, and by October, I would say you pretty much shut down. Another thing I think that was so difficult was because these young men all were my brothers, the anger at the waste of these young men, the anger at my government, and the anger at the army for not using these people properly
Right.
just became rage. And you can't function if you're raging. And so you just shut down so that you don't feel too much. You also had no time to process. We worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And if you lost someone, you just had to keep going because more were coming in the door. So you didn't have time. You never talked about it. The roommate that I was with over there also worked in intensive care. And when we were off, we never discussed what we were doing. I mean, we wanted to think about something totally different. So we never processed at all. We couldn't grieve the loss of these guys. You couldn't process the anger of the loss, or that they were somebody's child, somebody's brother, somebody's friend or husband.
Right.
Yeah, that took a while to figure out.
Does the Army have any way to help you cope with that, or do they just assume that you were a nurse and that you were used to that kind of thing?
I don't think they even thought of it.
Okay.
I The term PTSD really didn't happen until Vietnam.
Right.
And nobody really recognized it until the Vietnam vets yelled loud enough.
That
You
was
know,
after the war.
yep,
Yeah.
yeah. When we were in '69, when I was going home, the nurses that were coming in country said, as soon as you get off that airplane, take your uniform off. You will not be received well. And so a lot of it you just never talked about because nobody could understand anyway, and a lot of people didn't want to hear it. that my generation was extremely conflicted about that war, I think. And I think they still are in some ways.
Right.
Um, so it was really, it was the Vietnam vet, I think, that finally told the army and the government, you got to take care of us. Of all the soldiers and all the wars that we'd been in, and that they weren't going to stop saying that.
Right.
They were just going to keep going until they got what they needed. And I think that that's why, with this recent war, that everybody was accepted. All of these soldiers coming back. The Vietnam vets made an absolute purpose out of welcoming people home
Right.
and welcoming them back into the community, trying to help. And they still do.
Yeah. What would have been a typical day for you?
Well, you got up. You had to be at work by 7. You worked 7 to 7. And you started out just seeing, first of all, seeing who came in during the night. One half of where we were was the intensive care unit, and the other half was the recovery room. So they'd come back from surgery, you would wake them up in the recovery room, and then if they were going to stay with you, you switch them to the intensive care unit. Otherwise, you would send them back to a ward where they were going to be taken care of. But the ones that needed a lot of care stayed with us. And then you just started working. It depended on if you had a lot of help during the day, which you needed, because of procedures and things. But at night, there were 2 nurses, one for recovery, one for intensive care, and your corpsman. And if something big came in, you just had to handle it. If you got a lot of patients in, you just had to handle it.
Right.
I remember one night I was on alone because the gal who was supposed to be working with me didn't make it back from R&R. I guess her plane didn't come in or something. And so I was there alone with my corpsman, and we heard that we were going to get 6 guys in, 6 patients. And so I said to one of the corpsmen, because these were really great guys. I mean, they must have filtered them out to get smart ones to come to the care unit. But so I said to one of the guys, you're going to handle the intensive care unit, the other 2, and I will do the recovery room as they're coming in.
Right.
But what was interesting was, as the evening went on, the corpsmen that worked there just started dropping by to say hello and just went to work. And I would say by 11:30 or 12 at night, I think all of my corpsmen were in there. And they must have heard that something was coming in and just wanted to see if they could help out, and they could. And these guys were really fabulous, really wonderful, wonderful guys. Couldn't have done it without them, that's for sure.
Right. So it would have just been you and one other nurse typically?
Yes, and your corpsman.
Okay.
Yep, at night. You had more during the day.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So you work 7 to 7, the night shift.
Well, you switch shifts. Some weeks you work days,
Okay.
some weeks you. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What were living conditions like?
In Saigon, we lived in an old apartment building, I think it was, that was across the street from the hospital. And there was no air conditioning. You had a fan, luckily enough. One of those ceiling fans.
Right.
But it was hot and it was humid. Then after 6 months, I went to Pleiku. I kept thinking it must be better someplace else. So I went to Pleiku, which was on the Cambodian border, and they were being rocketed all the time. And So it was a different experience there, let me tell you. There we lived in a hooch, which had 6 nurses in it, and you had a shower. Everybody had their own room. They built the beds high off the floor, so if you were rocketed, you could climb under your bed. Um, and it was rustic, but that's kind of what you expect, at least what I
Right.
expected.
Right. Were there many rocket attacks while you were there?
Many. Pleiku rocketed quite, at least the hospital was. I think it was also because it was next to the Air Force had a airport there, and I think they rocketed that place too. But it was just a really active. You every night you took your flak jacket and your helmet
Right.
to work, and what you did was, if you were rocketed, you got your patients underneath their bed, and if you couldn't move the patient because they were severely wounded, then you put a mattress over them just in case something was falling from the ceiling.
Right. Okay. Tell me what goes through your mind the first time you're in a rocket attack. What's that like?
A surprise. Uh, um, being in Saigon, you knew that you weren't safe anywhere because that's what they tell you, and that's what the nurses told you,
Right.
But being in Pleiku, but you weren't being rocketed in Saigon. In Pleiku, they really sent the war to you, and you could feel the vibrations of the rockets hitting the ground, and but you just kept going. I mean, I think you just did what you needed to do, and you just kept going, and you didn't think about whether you were scared. I didn't, whether you were scared or not. And after a while, you didn't care. Oh, if the rocket hits, who cares? Because you had just seen enough.
Right. So it becomes, for lack of a better term, routine at that point.
Well, you make it routine in your
Right.
head.
Because you have to.
Yeah, so that it's not overwhelming, so you can do what you need to do for your patient.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Are you working 6 days a week typically?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. Sometimes more, but usually 6 days a week.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do on day 7?
Ah, sleep, read, relax. Some people were really party people, but I found that coming from a family of alcoholics, I was careful about alcohol. And I wanted to be alert for my patients.
Right.
And I know that it takes a while for alcohol to get out of your system. So I really was not into doing a lot of partying. Um, my friend Diane Carlson Evans, she was also from Minnesota, and she kind of had the same philosophy I did. Um, so we would do things together, or just be quiet together, you know, because you were on for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for your patients.
Right.
You needed to take a day off, you know.
Yeah. Did you have any opportunity?
Sometimes, like for instance, one of the gals that was there, we went into Pleiku to see what the town was like. And at that time, some of the roads were dirt roads, and we went to the local hospital, and the hospital was so well. For instance, the Montagnards were mainly the patients that were around at that time.
Okay.
We would take care of them too, but also they would come into that hospital. And if they came, the whole family came. And if the whole family came, the chickens came and the pigs came, and they would come to the hospital to be with the patient. Because if they left them at home, they wouldn't be there when they got back. So they had to bring everything. And so it was a totally different idea about taking care of people, but they did what they could do.
Yeah.
Now I hear that it's a city of 1 million people, which to me I cannot fathom. That in 3 months they're taking 12 of us who were nurses who served over there back to Vietnam, to the places where we served. So that's going to be kind of amazing.
Yeah. Wow. That will be amazing to see what it turned into. Well,
Yep.
yeah. Did how about R&R? Did you get a chance to leave it all for a few weeks?
Yep. When I was in Saigon, my roommate and I, Judy, went to Hong Kong. It was kind of funny because it had been like I'd been in country for 5 months and there's no place to spend money. And so you felt when you got off the plane like just throwing your money out and saying, "Give me anything," because you were so ready to go shopping. Um, and again, it's that's kind of what was bizarre about that war was that here you were in the war, and then you went to Hong Kong, and then you came back to this war, and it was when you look back at it, you think that was really bizarre. Diane Evans and I went to Bangkok together. And that was very interesting, touring around and seeing everything. And then coming back, we were back in the war. So it was a very strange war.
What you had some opportunity to interact with the Vietnamese people. What were they like? What was their attitude like towards you?
Actually, I didn't, unless they were patients. I mean, we had a mama san who would do our wash, clean our room. Um, and we had people who worked on the ward. We had a ward clerk, actually, who one morning, it was a guy, and I guess had been a ward clerk for a long time, but he was there when I was there. And one morning I came in and he wasn't there, and I said, "What happened to him?" And they said, "Oh, he was killed last night. He was VC." And you're sitting there, you know. So it was like these people that you thought were your friends were on the other side, and you didn't know. It's not like World War II, where by the uniform you could tell them,
Right.
tell who it was. You couldn't tell anything over there. And that was why you had to be very careful. One morning we got notice that we were going to get 9 in because they had been standing for a bus to pick them up. These were GIs. And somebody drove by on a motorcycle and threw a bomb.
Hmm.
And so you just never knew.
Yeah. Did you have any opportunity to keep in touch with family at all? Letters, phone calls?
Letters. It was interesting. You could call every now and then. It depended on if they had, this. It was this really strange phone that you could call on, and they would alert your family that you were going to be calling. And then after every sentence that you said, when you finished your sentence, you would say over, and then they would speak, and then they would say over. So it was very primitive. You are.
Right, right. So that would have been a Mars radio call, probably.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's right.
Yeah,
Yep,
yeah.
yep.
Did you guys know, there's a lot of negativity going on in the United States, a lot of protesting. The war wasn't popular. Did any of that creep into what you were doing? Were you aware of that going on?
Not so much over there because we didn't get much news.
Okay.
Um, I did know that my brother Charlie was arrested for protesting the war. And somebody had said to me, "Well, how did you feel about that?" And I said, "Well, I knew that Charlie hated the war, but I knew he loved me. His protest had nothing to do with me. So, because I didn't particularly like that war either. and what it was doing. And really, my feeling about the war protesters is, if they hadn't been there, we'd still be in Vietnam. I really believe that. We'd still be there.
Yeah. What incidents stand out in your mind? What are some things that you think about when you think about your time there, good or bad?
Oh boy. I think how I feel about my time over there. Well, there's so many different emotions. I've spoken to other nurses and they said, which I agree with, they'd do it again in a minute. They don't regret going over there at all, even though it changed your life 100%. I think what I feel most now is just sadness and sorrow for the loss of those guys. I can remember one time for work, I had to go to Washington, D.C., and it was in the morning that I was going to have to be doing what I was going to do. So I had the evening and I went down to the wall. And I went to the area of the wall where my guys would have been, my boys. And all of a sudden, I just started crying. And I just started saying, I am so sorry. So sorry that I couldn't save them, that their government did this to them. I think the rage and the anger has gone, and it's just really sorrow for the loss of these wonderful guys.
Yeah. How do you learn to cope with that after all these years?
Oh, it took a long time. First of all, it took a while just to figure out what I was feeling.
Yeah.
But I think I knew that I needed to get help. It was about 20 years after. And I was feeling so down. And I thought to myself, wait a second, your life is great. You have enough to eat, you got a job, got a husband, two little kids, having a good time, wonderful house, great friends, and you're feeling like driving off the road. What's the matter with you? And it was Diane Evans coming and saying, Edie, I think we need a monument for the women. And I said to her, well, adios, have fun. I can't. And but she kept at it. And it was before the dedication of the memorial, and she called me and she said, could you please just talk to some people out east? We don't have anybody, and they need to talk to nurses so that we can publicize this. And I said, I will if I can stop whenever I need to.
Yeah.
And, okay, we'll put that on the list. And before I did that, my daughter, who was at Mount Holyoke, um, she called me up, and there was a fellow there who taught a course on Vietnam. And he would start his course by saying, you women will never know what it's like to be at war. Well, my daughter called me up. She said, Mom, you need to come up here, talk to these people. And so she was taking a course on the 60s, which I said to her, is that history already? Come on. You know? And so she asked her professor, and he said, yes, love to have your mom. It was the first time I'd ever talked about it, but I did it at the right place. It was all women, where you felt immediately accepted. You didn't have to explain why you were there. And they were not my generation. And so they sat there and listened. And for the first time, I spoke about what it felt like to be a woman over there. And after, at the very last, little gal came up to me and she said, "Oh, Edie," she said, "actually, Mrs. Meeks, I would have welcomed you home." And I thought maybe it's going to be the next generation that welcomes us home. And that really opened me up to starting to talk about it and touch the wounds that I felt I had been harboring and not taking care of. So I think, and with doing that, little by little by little, and then I finally decided I got to go for help. The thing that pushed me over the edge was Diane had asked me to speak at the dedication of the Huey helicopter um, at the Smithsonian. So I said, sure, I'll be happy to. So I drove down, and we're at the Smithsonian, and we're going outside, and the helicopter's coming. It was the first, actually, I think, airplane or anything like that that had flown over the mall since 9/11. And so he was flying low, and he was just supposed to fly over and land. But being a Vietnam vet, he continued on and flew over the Vietnam Memorial, and then came back. And the thing that got to me was that you could hear the helicopter before you could see it. And that was a big trigger for a lot of us, a lot of the nurses. You would hear that helicopter and you think, oh God, more bad news, you know? Um, and so it landed, and these guys in fatigues all got out. And it was like, then I had to talk. So I gave the talk that I actually had prepared was about the sound of the helicopter, what it meant to the nurses. And after, the captain of the helicopter came up to me and he said, "Have you been inside of Huey since then?" And I said, "No, no, 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 don't even want to go near it." So he just tucked my arm, under his, and slowly, he was talking to everybody else, but we slowly walked out the door and walked up to the helicopter. And he said, "You can touch that. You don't have to go in. You can touch it if you want." And so finally I did. And I just started crying. And they had asked me if I was going to stay for the reception that evening. And I said, "No, I've got to go home." So I got back in my car and drove back home. And that was when I thought, I really have to get help. I cannot handle this alone. I don't know what I'm doing. So I went to the VA. And luckily enough, I was really lucky. I had a great fella a young man who I think we just graduated or something, because he had no idea what to do with a female Vietnam vet. Um, but the two of us worked it out, and it was, without his help, it was really terrific.
Yeah. What would you like people to know about your service? Somebody who might see this interview some years down the road. What do you want them to know about what you did over there?
We all did our best. We wish that we could save them all. And I think one of the things, and I have said this before when people ask about this, what I really learned was, and I told my kids this, that you shouldn't just sit on the sidelines and complain in life. You should step up. And I'm so glad that I stepped up and did what I thought I needed to do to help not only my country, but the people who were serving my country. And it changed my life, as I say, for 100%. But that's okay, because I wasn't just a complainer. As I said to them, it doesn't matter whether you had joined the army or whether you were a war protester. At least you stepped up and said, "This is what should be done." You didn't just sit by. So I think I'm just glad that I was a participant in history, in what we were doing.
Yeah. What advice would you give someone who's watching this?
War is not fun. War is awful. It's not a game. People don't get back up after they've been shot like they do on TV. It changes their lives and the lives of their families 100%. And it's not, especially now, it's not even the wounds of the physical wounds, but a lot of it is the mental and emotional wounds that these warriors carry are so damaging. I believe that if you ask someone to be a warrior for your country, you should give them everything they need. They shouldn't have to fight for a thing. If they say, "I was there," what do you need? Because if you didn't have PTSD before trying to get through the VA, you'd have it after. Let me tell you, the VA is abusive, I believe, for our warriors, and it's not fair. I also really believe that everybody should serve in some way, whether it's through a Peace Corps or doing something in country, for a year or two. People should serve. It shouldn't just be those who need a college education and can't afford it, so they go into the service or whatever it might be. It should be everybody. I think that was one of the reasons why we were there in Afghanistan for so long, was because if there had been a draft, we would have been out of there. But since there wasn't, oh well, it's not really affecting me.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to talk about we haven't touched on?
Oh boy. Oh, um, hmm. One of the things about being in the service in a war is that you really can't blame anybody. And my kids know that I was over there, and they've heard me speak before, and they're very proud of me, but they have no idea what it's really like. And it's too bad. My kids are very anti-war anyway, but um, it's too bad that everybody can't see what war does to people. We have never been invaded, really.
Right.
We have never lived under the fear of an oppressor. And in fact, I was talking to three World War II vets and a gal who had been at 7 years old in the underground
Mm.
in the Netherlands. And she said, "You have no idea what it was like. It was awful because you had no power at all." And so we're very lucky that we've never been invaded. But it's a very precious thing. And if we don't guard our democracy, we could lose it.
Yeah.
We should be very careful.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Well, Edie, on behalf of the Americans in Wartime Experience, I want to thank you for taking some time out of your day to share your story. I want to thank you for your service, and I want to welcome you home.
Thank you. Thank you. It was wonderful meeting you.
Great. Thank you.